So, suffering and religion. I said that I wanted to try to get inside the head of the ordinary person, and this is the angle that I developed in my own academic career. I basically wrote a book about all this stuff, so let me give you some of the ideas that were contained in the book. The history departments say they like it if I talk about my own research. So this is part of it, really, I suppose. And here we go. You've got the challenging of the church through the 95 Theses by Martin Luther, which happens in 1517. And the King of England at that time is, of course, Henry VIII. Okay? And as we've seen, people took it seriously enough to consider worth dying for. So suffering and religion were pretty closely connected at that time. And one of the ideas of the Protestants was that the Bible was the central text, much, much more important than what the church had been developing, because the church had developed many customs which were not in the Bible. So the Protestants were back to focusing on the Bible. That's got to be what it's all about. And one of the central things in the Bible was the question of suffering. Now, today we tend to think, what's suffering? I mean, suffering is just something we don't want to do. Okay, it's kind of taboo even on talking about it. If you see somebody in the Chu or concourse and you say, hey, hi, how are you? And they say, well, actually, you say, oh, okay. Yeah. You know, because you're not really, a lot of the time people aren't really asking, you know, how are you? They don't want to know if you're suffering or something like that. We kind of keep it hidden away. Psychological suffering, physical suffering, we try and keep it sort of away from society. But in those days, life was very different, and suffering was very much more in your face. It was something that you would see, and it would be around you every day. And so suffering was much more central than it is today to the way people saw their lives. So there's the question of why. For us, you know, we suffer, and when we suffer, we feel, well, that's a shame. We don't want to be suffering. We don't think of, like, why, that there's some meaning or purpose to it. On the whole, most of us don't. It's just something that we try to avoid. But according to the Bible, we're always suffering for a reason. Suffering is never meaningless. And in early modern times, when most people accepted the Bible as their central guiding principle in their lives, suffering was thought to have a purpose. So, let me tell you the kind of thing that I have in mind here. I'm out gardening in my garden in Hachioji, and it's January, right? And all of a sudden, I've got this huge rash covering the top half of my body. I have to go to the doctor, I have to go to the hospital, I have to take medication for it, and it's because of the hairs of a kemushi. You know, one of those little caterpillar things with spiky hairs on it. And okay, you know, I could sort of think, oh yeah, well, kemushi, it has to protect itself, and I thought that I was a risk to it. So, but no, the damn kemushi has been dead for months, since January. For crying out loud, what is the point? Okay, what is the point in having to suffer from the hairs of an insect that's been dead for bloody months? Okay? I find it very difficult to think that that is part of some purpose. All right? Okay? So, that's the kind of modern attitude that we might have. But look back at those days, they would always see suffering as having some kind of purpose. And you got basically two purposes. One is to punish the wicked, and the other is to purify the good. Okay? If you're a bad person, your suffering is just a taste of what's going to happen after you die. If you're a good person, your suffering is just going to make you more and more pure so that you're ready to go to heaven. So, firstly, let's look at the idea of suffering as punishment. Now, as I say, in today's world, suffering is something private. Even if suffering is used as a punishment, like hanging, which still exists here in Japan, it would happen away from the public gaze. It wouldn't be something that people would see. In those days, hanging was a public act. It was on public display. People would be hanged in front of everyone, the community, anybody who wanted to could see it as a spectacle, if you like, as a show even. So this very, very different attitude, even when suffering is inflicted as a punishment in the modern world, it's usually in private. It's usually not in front of a crowd of people. Well, my mother, who died a couple of years ago, lived in a little village called Rottingdean, and when I went back to England, I would do the shopping for her or something like that, and I would have to walk down a street called Whipping Post Lane. Okay, they still call the street there. There's no whipping post there now, but that's the name of the street. And there would have been a whipping post in every village, all over the country. In every town, in every village, there would be whipping posts. Like this. Okay, this one, because it's made from stone, it's still there. Mostly they were made of wood, and they've rotted away, and they're not there anymore. But some of them were made for stone, and a few of them are still around, like that one. People would be tied to that and whipped. It's as simple as that. Or they might be forced to put their heads through a block and their arms. This one would have been for two people. It's placed high up so they can be seen from a long way off, and it was probably used for unmarried people who'd had sex together. The crime, as it was in those days, of adultery. Here we have people being stripped to the waist and beaten in public, which went right on until the 19th century. Okay? And here's a Quaker being punished in 1656. They tie him to a cart. The cart moves forward. They whip him all the way through town. And I think, did they cut his tongue out afterwards or something horrible? Okay? This is the kind of dreadful thing that just went on routinely in those days. We've got beggars here, beggars and the homeless being whipped through the streets. This is in the 1530s. Remember, after the closure of the monasteries, charity suffered, and the care of poor people, which had been part of the work of the monasteries, those poor people were now left without any they had a much reduced chance of getting some kind of help from anywhere. So the answer was to whip them through the streets. We don't want you here. And here is a scene of women accused of being witches. Okay, being hanged. Again, this is in 1655, this is in the 17th century. So all through this period, 16th century, 17th century, this kind of thing was going on. Okay, so there's a pretty drastic situation here. Here are some more pictures showing that kind of thing. These are the stocks. This is the pillory. Here are people throwing things at them. You see, depending on how angry people were at them or how much they wanted to abuse them, they could throw rotten eggs or they could throw rocks. Okay? So their punishment could be very severe indeed. Okay? That's those beggars being whipped through the streets again. The witches. And the martyrs being burned for their religion. It wasn't just a punishment. In a way, it was a form of entertainment. And people would go, yes, even up to the 19th century, people would go to these public hangings and these public exhibitions of cruelty with their families, with a few bottles of beer and some sandwiches to sit there and watch other people dying. And it's not just the suffering of humans. If that wasn't enough for you, they had lots and lots of very cruel sports. They did horrible things to animals. Setting fire to a cat, for example, was a popular thing for people to entertain themselves with in those days. Queen Elizabeth, who was not, cruel in the way that her father was, and who, in general, tried to limit the amount of suffering that she had to impose as a queen. She tended only to kill people, only to put them to death when they were proven, definitely, to have plotted to kill her. She didn't just randomly kill people. Even she enjoyed watching dogs set against a bear, with people betting how many dogs will get killed by the bear before the dogs kill the bear. Okay? This is the kind of thing that people would enjoy. Even someone like Queen Elizabeth, who was, as I say, not noted for being particularly cruel. But it was more than just entertainment. Basically, it was reminding people that unless they had faith in God, they would be punished for their sins, not just in this world, but after death. You've got the message behind these public punishments that in the end, no one is going to escape the judgment of God. And people even believed that, if people were being punished in this world, they must deserve it, because God is there looking after everything. God is guiding everything. So if they didn't deserve it, God wouldn't let this happen to them. They must be deserving of their punishment. This argument was used especially for the burning the burning in Europe of witches, or the hanging in England of witches. That God wouldn't let innocent women die, so they must be guilty. Rather curious circular logic here, but that's the way that people justified it to themselves. But this idea that suffering comes from God also influenced the way people experience their own suffering. The idea that suffering comes from God, I've expressed it a little bit badly there, because to say that suffering comes from God makes it seem like God created suffering. But we're told that God didn't create anything bad. Well, it's a difficult question in theology about, where does suffering come from? And the argument that usually Christians give is it comes from human weakness. It's humans. We made the suffering happen. Adam and Eve didn't suffer in the Garden of Eden. When they showed their weakness and ate the apple, then that's when they brought suffering onto themselves. They brought suffering into this world. So, how do people experience their own suffering? When they see somebody being hanged like that in public, are they thinking that, well, me too, when I suffer, it's the same as that person being hanged? They're just suffering a little bit in this world, and then they're going to go on and suffer forever after they die. Is that what my suffering is? Okay? Just a taste of what's going to happen to me after death. Okay, let's look at another angle of suffering, the fact that you could not escape from it. It wasn't just around you on public display, but you also were going to suffer. You were not going to be able to escape. It wasn't just criminals, it wasn't just, it should be dumb animals there, there's a word missing. It wasn't just criminals and dumb animals. Constant exposure to the suffering of others was what's going on? There's something wrong there. Sorry, something wrong with that. I'll check that before I make it into a video for you. It was a reminder that suffering was something that no one could escape from. Everybody was going to get sick. Everybody was going to die. Nobody was going to be allowed to escape from this. And there were no anesthetics, there were no painkillers. Dental surgery, for example, if you had to have a tooth pulled out, they'd just tie a piece of string around it and bang, slam a door, and just boom, that would hoik your tooth out. Okay? It'll hurt. Yeah, it'll hurt. That's what happens. If you needed an operation, your body would be cut open while you were fully conscious. Okay? Early modern operations were performed on fully conscious people with implements like this. Okay? Imagine somebody using something like that on you while you were fully conscious. Okay? That's the kind of thing that people would be facing. So, because of this, because suffering was all around people when they were alive, and because they were threatened with eternal suffering after they died, people naturally wanted to make sense of their suffering. And as I say, for bad people, that was pretty clear. They were being punished. But good people also suffered. So how are they going to explain that good people suffer just as much as bad ones? What was the meaning of the suffering of good people? Well, as I say, rather than being a punishment, their suffering was a form of purification, or it was considered to be a form of purification. It was considered to be God's way of preparing those who were chosen to go to heaven by purifying them in this world through suffering. Are we okay? Yeah? All right. And, okay, this is not English, and it's also slightly earlier than our period, but it shows the situation very clearly. The Garden of Earthly Delights by the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch. If we take a look at this in some detail, we can see these kinds of things. On the left of this triptych being a painting in three parts, on the left-hand side, we've got what seems to be the Garden of Eden. But it's a... Oh, sorry. Damn, I've done something wrong there. Let's try that again. Okay, here's the Garden of Eden, and yeah, if we look at it, we can see that there are some quite surprising things going on there. There's some quite violent scenes, some quite. It's not all. He's not all wonderful. It's not all. You've got these curious creatures lurking in the corners of the picture. You've got God here taking Adam and Eve, but you've got a cat catching what looks to be possibly a rat or something like that, which is curious because the normal understanding from the Bible was that in the early days, lions and tigers and all of those things were all vegetarian. Okay, it's only later on that it's said that animals will eat each other. But we've got this kind of strange kind of violence creeping up, as if there's no way that Adam and Eve are going to be able to escape that. As if God knows what he's doing when he introduces them here. In the center of the picture, we've got the world of pleasures, the world of earthly pleasure, the garden of earthly delights. You can see, basically, it seems to involve pretty much every form of sex that you can imagine. Yeah. Okay, this is the garden of earthly delights. These are the pleasures that people take in their life, the pleasures of this world. And then on the right-hand side of the triptych, we get the basic idea: you pay for your pleasures. You pay a stiff price, and you will end up like this. Okay? That knife will cut between your ears. You'll be reduced to a horrific sort of cycle of suffering where you'll be fed into the mouth of some horrible thing, and you'll be shat out again, and you'll go round and round, and this kind of thing. You'll be fed in, and you'll go round and round in this horrible cycle of suffering. These are all sort of showing kind of like a circle of unending suffering that goes on round and round. And this is what you're going to end up with. You're going to pay for your pleasures. Okay, I think that's a particularly clear example. All right. So this is what we call the economy of suffering. The idea that you pay for your pleasures. Now, both Catholics and Protestants have this idea that you're going to pay for your pleasures. You can't just have pleasure without paying for it. And on the other side of that, if you have to pay for your pleasures, you can also be rewarded for your suffering. Okay? Can you see how the economy of suffering works positively in that way of thinking? You have to pay for your pleasures, but you can be rewarded for your suffering. Now, this was something that Catholics and Protestants both had, an idea that they both had, but their way of understanding it was very different. This is one of the big differences between Catholics and Protestants. I've talked a little bit about it before, but perhaps you can understand it more clearly now when I show this idea of the economy of suffering, where you are rewarded for your suffering. Because the Catholic idea of being rewarded for your suffering is, oh great, that means I can whip myself, and then I can hurt myself in various ways, and then God will like that, and I'll go to heaven. I can make myself suffer. Well, that's what the Catholics came up with, and they had this system of penances, and it was a way of purifying yourself through suffering. And those penances would include things like fasting. We've talked about some of these before. Hair shirts, whipping yourself, that sort of thing. And this came, again, I mentioned this before, but as I keep saying to you, if I say it 2 or 3 times, it means that, it's probably going to be in the test or something. The idea of penances came largely from St. Jerome's translation of the Bible. This is the Latin Bible that was used all over Europe until the Reformation. Latin continued to be the language of Europe, the common language of Europe, the language of educated people in particular. So there's St. Jerome. He's the model for early modern Catholics. He lived the ascetic life of a hermit. He was famous for his fasting. He was famous for his penances. He's the kind of role model for Catholics. They aimed to live his kind of life. This would be the ideal life for an early modern Catholic, to model their life on St. Jerome. So it's part of this system of justification by works, the system by which people would qualify to go to heaven through their actions, through the things they did. And so suffering through penances was one of those things. Other things would be praying and doing charitable works. And so we talked about justification by works. And again, I just want to show how that fits into the idea of suffering. So Protestants, on the other hand, argued, as I said before, that Jerome had made a big mistake here. He got it all wrong, and the original word, penitentiam, should really be repentance. And repentance is something people feel in their hearts. It's not something they can do. They have to feel it. And so acts of penance were wrong. So they still believed that suffering was important, but they believed that people should patiently suffer whatever suffering God sent. They shouldn't look for it themselves. They can't make themselves suffer. That doesn't count. God has to choose you to suffer. Okay? And that would be represented by the figure of Job in the Bible. We've also got the Stoic philosophy of the ancient Greeks. The Stoic is the person who puts up with the difficulties of life. So the Stoic philosophy of the ancient Greeks fits quite well with the idea of being patient and accepting suffering like Job does in the Bible. He doesn't try to suffer. He doesn't whip himself. He wants to be happy. He was happy, in fact, until one day the devil, according to the Bible, the devil came to God and said, "That Job down there, he's doing very well, isn't he? Look at the number of cows he's got. Look at his children. Isn't he doing well?" And God says, yes, he's a very good servant of mine. The devil says, would he be such a good servant if he was suffering? As long as God's giving him blessings and lots of cows and a beautiful, wife and lots of children and money and everything. Of course he's a good servant of yours, God. Give him to me for a little while. Let me make him suffer. Let's see how good he is then. Let's see how good a servant he is of God then. And the devil is allowed by God to make Job suffer. And Job suffers in all sorts of ways, and he suffers patiently, but he remains faithful. He trusts God, and he continues to be a good believer in God. And so this is what the Protestants would aim for in their way of understanding suffering. So Protestants believe that you should accept whatever suffering God sent. And it's wrong to try to purify yourself by making yourself suffer. And that's part of the system of justification by faith, which is all connected with the idea of predestination and the idea that, you have to trust that God chose you to go to heaven. Okay, so that's how suffering relates to, that's the two different models of suffering of Catholics and Protestants. So this ends up creating a very difficult situation for the Protestants. It's not easy to be a Protestant at this time.
Ouch!
You've got this God that's supposed to be merciful and watching over us like a shepherd watches over his sheep. And then you've got the fact that you get it wrong, some of us are going to go to hell and burn. How do we fix those? How do we put those two things together? How do we understand a God that on the one hand is a kind, merciful God that watches over us like a shepherd watches over his sheep, and the fact that some of us are going to burn in hell? All right, this is a problem for those people who are living their lives. It's a problem for the Christian religion in general, and it's a particular problem in this early modern period. It's a problem for Catholics and Protestants, but I'm going to start off by looking at it from the Protestant point of view. So the early Protestants wanted to know, how could they be sure that they'd been chosen by God to go to heaven, or if they were going to go to hell? There must be some kind of sign. All right? We know that they were told, look, just have faith, just trust that God has chosen you to go to heaven. But the Bible gives us a strong hint that there is a kind of sign. So you can say, I do believe that I'm one of the chosen because, and it's all connected with suffering. Okay? Because of the way I suffer. Remember what we said, there are two ways to suffer. One way is as a punishment before you go to hell, and the other is as a purifying experience before you go to heaven. So, how do you suffer? That would be the big question for those early modern Protestants. The Bible says not only that we suffer, but it says that we should rejoice to suffer for Jesus Christ. Christ suffered for us, and we should be happy to suffer for Jesus Christ. So when those kemushi cover my body, I should be saying, I am so happy that I can take part of the suffering of Jesus Christ. All right? I have to I don't just suffer, I rejoice I happily suffer. All right? And if you read the accounts of the martyrs who died under Mary and things, the word joyful or rejoicing, it often comes into it that they burn happily because they know that they're going to go to heaven. And so one of the signs that you've been chosen by God to go to heaven was that God would choose you to be purified through suffering. Now, unlike the Catholics, you can't make yourself suffer. You have to wait until, God chooses you. Now this, I think, is a situation that leads to extraordinary psychological stress at that time. Let's look at it. Here you've got your Protestant gentleman, and here you've got God. And we've got something like this. I rejoice to suffer for Jesus Christ. Ta-da! That's because you're one of the chosen. Your suffering is to purify you before you go to heaven. Well done. Okay? You're okay. But what about this? I suffer, like those kemushi, but I don't rejoice to suffer. I just suffer. It hurts. Well, that is because you are not one of the chosen. If it just hurts and you don't rejoice, then that's a sign that this is just part of the punishment that you're going to suffer after you die. It's just suffering. It's just pain. There's nothing purifying about it. Oh my God. So when I wake up, think, oh God, my back's killing me, and oh, no, I'm not rejoicing. I've got to go to work, That means you're going to go to hell. Wow. How bad is that? How heavy is that? What kind of psychological pressure is that? When you wake up and your back's killing you, or you've got a terrible headache, or you're suffering in some way, you have to be happy with it. Can you see how terrible that must have been? What a situation that must have been like for people. That if they weren't rejoicing to suffer, then they were thinking, oh my God, it means I'm going to go to hell. Okay, it just hurts. Okay, it doesn't hurt in a way that makes me feel, oh, I'm so lucky that I can suffer for Jesus Christ. I wish it would go away. It just hurts. And when that happened, they would be feeling that God was telling them that they were going to go to hell. What about the person who says, I rejoice, but I don't suffer? I have a happy and trouble-free life. Well, there you go. That one you definitely pay. Okay, if you're enjoying your life right now, then, oh boy, and you're not suffering, well, it's very clear. You're just going to go to hell. You're going to pay for your pleasures, and you're going to go to hell, and you're going to burn forever. Right. Okay, thank you so much, God. And what about the person who's depressed? I don't suffer, but I don't rejoice either. I mean, nobody's actually, sticking a knife into my throat, and I'm not physically ill. I'm just a bit depressed. Well, you're miserable because you know in your heart, again, that you're not one of the chosen. So, if you're depressed, then you're going to go to hell. You've got one chance in 4, and it's the hardest one. Okay, the other 3 possibilities, you're going to go to hell. You're going to burn. This is not a very good kind of philosophy for a cheerful society, is it? It's not going to make people happy. But that's what they lived with. That was the theology, that was the basic understanding that people were told under the Protestant system, that was how their lives were structured. That only if they could suffer and rejoice to suffer would they be eligible to go to heaven. So you get one of the very strong Protestants, they're called Puritans. And one of the Puritans in the 17th century was a man called John Bunyan, very famous. Wrote a very famous book called The Pilgrim's Progress. Now, this guy spent his whole life torturing himself. He thought, oh, I feel good this morning. Oh dear, does that mean that I'm going to go to hell? And oh, I feel terrible this morning, but I can't rejoice to feel terrible. That also means I'm going to go to hell. And he just writes he wrote a book of his life, his psychology. And every page is terrible until they take him and put him in prison. He thinks, oh, thank God, you put me in prison. I'm suffering, and I didn't choose it for myself. I'm just suffering, and other people are making it happen to me. I'm suffering for Jesus Christ. Yahoo! For the first time in his life, the guy is actually happy, okay? Because he's been put in prison. All right? So early modern Protestant theology didn't really offer much comfort. So unless you were suffering and at the same time rejoicing to suffer, otherwise you were going to go to hell. So it's a pretty tall order, a pretty stiff condition for going to heaven. And of course, this would lead to a lot of mental suffering. Alec Ryrie has written a wonderful book on being Protestant in early modern England. And he gives the example of Nehemiah Wallington, whose diary, again, shows a similar preoccupation with suffering and the problem of, well, suffering just hurts. I can't bring myself to feel glad about that. I can't feel that I rejoice about that. It just bloody hurts. And this leads to a kind of despair, because the Calvinists, all right, remember Calvin, one of the big reformers, his doctrine of predestination would tell you that if you were just suffering and it just hurt and you didn't feel that you could rejoice to suffer, that meant you were going to go to hell. So, as Riley puts it, large numbers of Protestants were certainly haunted by the fear that they might be irrecoverably damned, that they were going to go to heaven, and many were, at least sometimes, absolutely convinced that they were. So you've got a lot of depressed people who are going around saying, well, I'm going to go to hell anyway. So it didn't always work out the way that the reformers like Calvin and Luther imagined it would, that people would think, oh, isn't it wonderful, Jesus Christ has come to save us. They think, no, Jesus Christ has come to save everybody else, not me. I'm not in that book. Okay? They couldn't even enjoy getting drunk, you know. They couldn't enjoy anything. Their whole life was a misery for them. Okay? So this is when you start to get the first books on something like psychology. And so the mental despair comes from the way that people feel when they're in physical pain. They couldn't rejoice in their pain, and they couldn't experience their suffering as being a sign of God's mercy. So Richard Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, which is, melancholy is really just like the same idea. Today we call it depression. Okay? Kiga omoi koto. Okay? The word that's used here is melancholy, but it's the same basic thing. And he writes a kind of anatomy, an analysis of melancholy, why people get depressed. And a big part of it is because of religion. Here's the title page of that book, showing different types of melancholy. And it illustrates some of the major causes of depression, jealousy, okay, thinking that what somebody else has got is better than what you've got, solitude, okay, not being alienated, being outside society, not having friends or family, not feeling that you belong to a community. Love. Love was often seen as a sickness. The ancient Greeks saw it as a sickness. Okay, love is actually a form of illness. It's a mental problem that people have to be in love. All right? You're not seeing the world straight when you're in love. and it leads to unhappiness. Hypochondria, where you believe that you're sick. I mean, people will say, I'm dying, and they go on for years with it. You know what I'm like, and it's a mental attitude, okay, of believing that they're sick. And it leads them to be depressed. Superstition, which basically means the Catholic religion. Okay? If they follow the Catholic religion, they're going to make themselves unhappy. Madness, okay, the relationship between madness and unhappiness. They weren't very sophisticated in the idea of madness. You know, madness was until the 19th century, when people like Freud come along and start talking about different kinds of madness. Madness is just madness. Okay? And what makes Burton's work unusual here is that he doesn't try to explain it all in the religious context. He sees the religious context quite often as being part of the problem. It's medical explanations, secular explanations that are not connected with religion. This is really the first book of its kind, and it's part of the movement away from the religious world that people are living in into the world of the Enlightenment, which comes fully into existence really in the 18th century, and it's when people start, the society turns its back on this kind of dark way of looking at life that is all focused on, are you going to go to hell or heaven after you die, and just starts saying, look, let's just sort of stop getting into that little corner, and let's look at the bigger picture. Let's look at other things that are going on. There's a whole world here that we're turning our backs on while we focus on, am I going to go to hell after I die? There are other things to be dealing with. So this is an early step towards the Enlightenment, away from the religious understanding of the world to a secular understanding. So, the later 17th and 18th centuries, people turn away from all of this. A very good example of how the Enlightenment shows a completely different attitude. In the 17th century, if somebody said, "Oh, you're a witch," you would be punished. Guess what happens in the 18th century? If anybody goes around saying, "You are a witch," they punish that person. Because witches don't exist, you idiot. Okay? They completely changed their thinking. So by the 18th century, the person who gets punished is the person who accuses people of being witches. Or even the person who says, "I am a witch." They get punished as well, because you can't be a witch. The witches don't exist. Okay? So the way of thinking is completely changed. Instead of punishing the witch, they punish the person who says that somebody's a witch, even if they say that they themselves are a witch. That can't be true, because witches don't exist. That's a typical example of how the Enlightenment was changing the way that people thought about things as the 18th century gets underway. But we're still in the 17th, 16th and 17th centuries. In his chapter on religious melancholy, Burton particularly talks about predestination and the idea of Calvin, justification by faith. That is one of the causes of early modern depression. So he's living there at the time. He can see it. All right? He identifies religion and the attitude towards religion as being part of the problem of people's psychological distress. And in Shakespeare, we can see it perhaps mostly in Hamlet. He's a typical example of this depressive character. And he also is obsessed with the idea of predestination and what God has chosen for him, and is God choosing him the path of going to heaven. And of course it's a tragedy. He's going to go to hell. He's damned. All right, it's all about somebody that God has not chosen. And when God hasn't chosen you, God plays with you, God toys with you, God punishes you. That's what we see in the case of Hamlet. So Hamlet is the typical melancholy character, and in one of his speeches, the speech where the actor is on the stage by himself, or where the actor is speaking out loud like this, saying what he or she thinks. It's called a soliloquy. I have of late, recently, but wherefore I know not, I don't know why, I've lost all my mirth, all my sense of humour, forgone all custom of exercises. I don't take exercise, I just sit around all day, feeling miserable. And indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof, fretted with golden fire. Why, it appears no other thing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. You look out there and you see a beautiful spring day. I look out there and I just see blue. Okay? It's nothing to, it doesn't make my heart jump up in joy. I'm depressed, basically. What a piece of work is man. Oh, humanity, yeah, sure, wonderful thing. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet to me, what is this? Quintessence of dust. She needs some more on the lap. Just going to go back to being dust. She needs me married. Okay? Wow! Hamlet. Go to the doctor today and he'll give you some pills. All right? But what did you do when you were in the 17th century and you felt like that? Okay? So, Hamlet is a very good example of the melancholic, depressive of the early modern period. And basically, he's upset, apparently, because his father has died, but there's much more to it than that. Again, he's thinking all the time about what's going to happen after he dies. In that to be or not to be, that is the question, very famous speech that everybody knows. He says, to die, to sleep no more, okay? But in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. So I'm dead and it's like I'm asleep, except that in my sleep I'm having a dream, and in that dream I am in hell. All right? That must give us pause. We don't live our life here on this world the way we should. And this is it. People say that to be or not to be speech is about suicide, but it's not. It's about we don't live our life because we're afraid of what may happen to us after death. He says, why would we put up with everything in this? Why don't we just kill the people who give us problems? Why don't we just fight back and, take arms against the sea of troubles? Why don't we fight back and just live our life? And I'm here and I'm doing my thing. Because we're afraid of what's going to happen after we die. We're here living a kind of half-life. We're not properly living our lives. And so a large part of his depression comes from thinking about, if he really acts the way he wants to, God will surely send him to hell. And of course, in his case, God's going to send him to hell anyway. There's no escape. He mistakenly kills the father of his lover, the woman he's supposed to marry. And we know that he's going to go to hell when he does that. He's killed a man, even though he didn't. He thought he was killing his enemy,
but he got the wrong person because he couldn't see the person's face when he did it. And he found, oh, it's not my enemy, it's somebody else. But we know from then on that he's going to go to hell. So maybe his fate was determined even before that. He was predestined. Okay, this whole idea of destiny comes into Shakespeare's play here. He's not condemned because he kills Polonius. He kills Polonius because he's condemned. I mean, from the beginning, he's going to go to hell. So from the beginning, he's going to kill Polonius. And those are the kinds of questions that come up again and again in early modern literature. And this idea of suffering has a political dimension as well. People are taught that suffering is a sign that they've been chosen by God. So in the political system, it would be like, oh, you know, people are complaining about the hardship of life, and the politicians, you know, the government can say that, but that's okay. It's fine that you're suffering. It means that you're going to go to heaven. Okay, so people were kept under control politically. Okay, the Elizabethans and the Stuarts were quite good at seeing the political dimensions of this, and saying to people, well, you should be proud to suffer. You should be rejoicing to suffer. You shouldn't be complaining about it. Here, let's give you a bit more suffering, and this time enjoy it. Okay, so they're kind of pushing the society into accepting its troubles. And there's a book by an American, Melissa Sanchez. She writes Erotic Subjects, the Sexuality of Politics. She's starting to get the idea that this sort of politicizing of suffering and saying, well, you know, you should be enjoying it. And that's getting very close to modern ideas of masochism, isn't it? Okay? That's why she's talking about it as erotic and the sexuality of politics. She's seeing it as being kind of moving over, not for religious suffering, but into kind of masochistic suffering. Okay? That again, of course, the idea that there's something masochistic about suffering is part of why suffering is a taboo in our modern society. Because I think she's got a point here. And in my own researches, I found that at the beginning of the century, Protestants would be saying, ha ha, look at those Catholics, look at how they whip themselves. They should whip themselves because they're naughty boys. And by the end of the 17th century, it's sort of saying, ha ha ha, they enjoy whipping themselves. Okay, it's become sexualized, all right, over the course of the 17th century. At the beginning of the century, it wasn't. By the end of the century, it was. So that's an interesting sort of chapter in the history of ideas. And particularly from this political point of view, the suffering of women was of particular importance. Remember those female martyrs, the women who suffered as martyrs. People like Anne Askew, Alice Driver, who bravely died for their beliefs, bravely died for their faith. The abject, feminized figure of the martyr was the model to which the virtuous male subject ought to aspire, as Sanchez says. To be a true man, you had to be able to suffer like a woman. What are you complaining about? You're a man. And look at what those women suffered. You can't even put up with a few little hardships. They burn. What kind of man are you if you can't even suffer the way a woman does? Okay, so they use sexuality or they use gender as a way of kind of forcing the society to accept any kind of injustice or suffering that was being imposed on it. And we're talking about, something as horrible as this. Anne Askew was particularly famous. She was martyred under Henry, not under Mary. But she was an early Protestant, and you remember Henry didn't like Protestants, and it was unusual partly because she was a woman, but also because she was high class. She attracted a lot of attention, and she was tortured to tell the names of the other reformers, the other Protestants, and she never gave those names. She died with her mouth closed. She never gave away the names of the other reformers. She was tortured so badly that she couldn't walk, and this form of torture is known as the rack. All right, and we still use that word rack in a metaphorical sense. You say he was racked with pain, meaning he was suffering terrible pain. The rack was an instrument of torture that would eventually break the back. As you can see, she's being stretched out across this in this horrible way. Meanwhile, the Catholics were continuing to use Jerome's translation of the Bible with its idea of penance. And these penitential practices continue to be a part of Catholic ritual and still to some extent continue today, although they don't include physical suffering the way they used to, even in, until about the 1980s or something. I can't remember exactly when they started saying it's okay, you don't have to physically punish yourself. Okay, so that went up until, in my lifetime, they were still doing this. Okay. I had a friend who went to university, went to a Catholic school, and they were expected to suffer. Okay? And the Protestants looked down on this, saying that was complete misunderstanding of the Bible. Well, by the end of the early modern period, you've come through to Protestants having a kind of common sense view of suffering, that you accept it when necessary, but you're not out looking for it. The Protestants have kind of been moving in that direction. If we have to suffer, okay, we will. They started to lose the idea of, if I don't rejoice, I'm going to go to hell. They just sort of got a little bit more practical about it and said, well, we can't avoid it, so we just put up with it. But we shouldn't be actively looking for it. And that's where the Catholics, because they actively make themselves suffer, the anti-Catholic rhetoric goes towards kind of, what do you call it, sort of proto-masochist sort of thing, where they're being accused of kind of enjoying hurting themselves. So that's probably part of how that developed. So by the time you get to the Enlightenment, people are, at the end of the 17th century, starting to think that we have a right to enjoy our lives in this world, and there's nothing wrong with being happy. In fact, the whole idea of rights is fairly new. You see, in that world where you're going to burn in hell if you're a bad person, and you're going to go to heaven if you're a good person, no, the rights don't matter. Nothing that happens to you in this world really matters. The more you suffer, if you're a good person, the more quickly you're going to get into heaven anyway, from the Catholic point of view. Okay? And the more you suffer if you're a bad person, well, it doesn't matter because you're going to burn forever when you die. So the idea of rights starts to develop, and the idea of rights is a central part of the Enlightenment, that people have rights. They have a right not to suffer unnecessarily, and those kinds of things. Not everybody, of course, changed their way of thinking suddenly. People didn't all wake up one morning and say, oh, it's the Enlightenment now, we don't have that way of thinking. But generally, the society is moving in that direction, where it's thinking about human rights and it's looking at life in a more open, broad, philosophical way, not in a narrow, religious way. And you're getting scientific advances, medicine. Medicine will be part of that. You can avoid suffering. So anesthetics and things like that. And it's no longer seen as being wrong to live a life of pleasure. So slowly, the early modern focus on suffering comes to be seen during the course of the later 17th and 18th centuries and moving forwards to today, came to be seen as unhealthy, a kind of obsession with suffering. Okay, so to wind up then, the Bible was of central importance during this early modern period. And because of that, Protestants believed that being able to accept and even rejoice in your suffering was a sign that you were going to go to heaven. But Protestants couldn't force themselves to suffer. They couldn't make themselves suffer. They couldn't impose suffering on themselves. God had to choose them. So this was a source of anxiety for people who couldn't rejoice in their suffering, and they simply felt that they were going to go to hell after they died because they couldn't rejoice to suffer. And politically, this idea that suffering was something to be patiently accepted, that made it possible for the government to convince citizens that they shouldn't protest against tyranny and just accept whatever happened as being part of God's plan. So it was exploited for political purposes as well at that time. And that's basically it. You've got medical advances. So that people are slowly becoming able to avoid suffering more than before. And you've got the Protestant hatred of what the Catholics were doing. So those two things lead to the kind of taboo on suffering that we've got now. Suffering, as I said at the beginning, is pushed out of sight in our modern world and talked about as little as possible. Okay.